Murphy was a good dog. He didn't bark too much. He didn't jump on strangers. He loved belly rubs, naps in the sun, and long walks with his owner, Mrs. Lewis. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Murphy as the gentle golden. He even let toddlers tug on his ears without making a fuss. But one day, everything changed. It started on a warm spring morning. Murphy was lying near the front gate, enjoying the breeze. That's when Grace walked by. Grace was the young woman who lived next door. She had just found out she was going to be a mom. Everyone was happy for her. She always smiled and waved at Murphy. And Murphy always wagged his tail back. But this time, he didn't wag. He stood up slowly, ears forward. He growled. Not loud, just a deep rumble from his chest. Grace stopped in her tracks. "Murphy?" she said softly, tilting her head. "What's wrong, buddy?" Murphy barked, sharp and loud. Then he barked again, and again. Mrs. Lewis ran out of the house. "Murphy, stop it," she shouted. "What's gotten into you?" Murphy wouldn't stop. His fur stood up. He pushed against the gate like he wanted to get to Grace. "I'm so sorry," Mrs. Lewis said, embarrassed. "He never does this." Grace tried to laugh it off. "It's okay," she said, but she looked nervous. Her hand rested on her stomach. The next day, it happened again. Murphy saw Grace. He barked wildly. He growled. He howled like he was in pain. Grace took a step back. "That's not okay," she whispered, her voice shaking. Mrs. Lewis was shocked. "Murphy, no. Come inside." By the third day, Grace was frightened. "I don't feel safe," she told her husband, Dan. "That dog stares at me like I'm some kind of threat. He barks like he's warning me. What if he gets out?" Dan frowned. "I'll talk to them." That evening, Dan knocked on the Lewises' door. Murphy barked from behind the glass door. "I don't want to make a big deal," Dan said, "but your dog is scaring my wife. She's pregnant. She doesn't need this stress." Mrs. Lewis looked worried. "I understand. He's never been like this before. I swear, it's only around her. With everyone else, he's normal." "We're not asking for much," Dan said. "Just keep him away from the fence." Murphy watched from the window. His eyes were wide and serious. His nose pressed against the glass. He barked again as Grace walked by on the sidewalk. That night, the neighborhood was quiet, but Murphy wasn't. He paced by the window. He whined. He barked at the door, the window, the fence. Mrs. Lewis sat on the couch, confused and worried. "What are you trying to tell us?" she asked softly. Her husband shook his head. "I don't know. But if this keeps up, we'll have to do something." For the next few days, things didn't get better. If anything, they got worse. Murphy's barking became louder, more desperate. It didn't matter whether Grace was walking outside, sitting in her yard, or even just opening a window. As soon as he saw her, Murphy would start. His growls were deep, his barks sharp and full of warning. He was a different dog, a dog full of tension. Dan noticed how stressed Grace was getting. Her face was pale, and her eyes were tired. She was just a few months away from having the baby, and this constant stress was wearing her down. "I can't take this anymore," she said one night. "Every time I go outside, he's there, barking. It feels like he's warning me about something, and I can't figure out what." Dan sat beside her, rubbing her back. "I'll talk to them again. Maybe we can figure out what's going on." The next morning, Dan went to the Lewises' house. He knocked loudly, but there was no answer. He knocked again. Finally, Mrs. Lewis came to the door, looking tired and worried. "I need to talk to you about your dog," Dan said, trying to stay calm. "Grace is getting really scared. I don't know what's happening, but it's getting worse. What are you going to do about it?" Mrs. Lewis looked at the ground, biting her lip. "We don't know. He's never been like this before. Murphy's always been gentle with everyone. He's never acted out like this, until Grace. I know you don't want to make a problem, Dan said, but you have to keep him away from our yard. Grace doesn't feel safe with him. If it keeps going like this, I'll have to call animal control. Mrs. Lewis sighed. I don't want that. I don't. But I don't know how to fix it. I'm not saying we're going to do that just yet. But please, try to keep him inside or away from the fence. Dan said, his voice softer now. We just need some peace. After a long pause, Mrs. Lewis nodded. I'll try. That night, Murphy's barking was worse than ever. Grace couldn't sleep. The sound of Murphy's growls cut through the night like a sharp blade. I don't think he's going to stop until he gets what he wants, Grace whispered to Dan, sitting up in bed. Her voice was trembling. Dan squeezed her hand. We'll figure it out. I'm going to stay up tonight and keep an eye on him. Dan went outside to stand by the fence. Murphy was at the gate, pacing back and forth. His eyes were wide, his body stiff. He was growling low, deep in his chest. The moonlight made his fur shine, but his expression was anything but peaceful. It was as if he was guarding something. Hours passed. Dan stayed by the gate, watching Murphy. Finally, around 2 a.m., Murphy stopped pacing. His eyes were fixed on the door of the house. He was watching Grace's window. Then, Murphy suddenly stopped. His whole body went still. Dan frowned. It was like something had clicked. Murphy was no longer growling, but he was still staring. Dan's heart pounded. Something didn't feel right. He walked back to the door, his footsteps slow. As he approached, the lights in the house flickered. Then, Grace screamed. Dan rushed inside, his mind racing. Grace was on the floor. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. Her breathing was shallow, quick. She had collapsed. Dan knelt beside her. Grace, Grace, are you okay? She couldn't answer. Her hand pressed against her stomach. Dan's heart raced. He grabbed his phone. 911. Now, the phone call to 911 seemed to take forever. Dan's heart was pounding in his chest as he tried to keep calm, but his mind was racing. He couldn't understand what was happening. Grace, his wife, was lying on the floor, barely conscious. Her face was pale, and her breathing was shallow. Her hand was pressed against her stomach, and he could feel the fear gripping him tighter with every passing second. The operator on the other end of the line spoke quickly. Sir, help is on the way. Stay with her. Can you tell me what happened? Dan's voice was shaky as he answered. She just collapsed. I don't know what's wrong. She's pregnant, and I'm scared. Something's wrong with the baby. Okay, sir. We need you to stay calm. Help is coming. Try to keep her comfortable. Keep talking to her. Stay on the line. Dan sat next to Grace, holding her hand, trying to keep her awake. Grace, stay with me. Please stay with me. Help is coming. But Grace couldn't respond. She just lay there, her face twisted in pain. Dan's mind was spinning. What had happened? Why had she suddenly collapsed like this? In the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the thought of Murphy. Why had the dog been acting so strangely? Why had Murphy been so focused on Grace? It wasn't just the barking. It was like he knew something that no one else could see. The sirens finally pierced the air, and within minutes, paramedics burst into the house. They quickly moved Grace onto a stretcher, hooking her up to monitors. Dan followed closely behind as they rushed her to the ambulance. Stay with her, Dan, one of the paramedics said. We'll take care of the rest. He nodded, trying to keep his composure. He climbed into the ambulance beside Grace. The ride to the hospital felt like an eternity. Every bump in the road sent a jolt through his body. All he could think about was Grace and the baby. When they arrived at the hospital, doctors and nurses rushed to her side. Dan was led to the waiting room, his stomach twisted in knots. He sat there for what felt like hours, waiting for any word on Grace's condition. Finally, the door opened, and a doctor walked in. He was tall, wearing a white coat, and his face was serious. "Mr. Thompson?" the doctor asked. Dan stood up quickly. "Yes, how is she? Is she okay?" The doctor took a deep breath. "We've stabilized her, but she's been through a serious situation. Grace has suffered what we call a placental abruption. It's when the placenta separates from the uterine wall too early. This can cause heavy bleeding and can be life-threatening for both the mother and the baby." Dan's heart sank. "Is the baby okay?" The doctor nodded slowly. "We were able to stop the bleeding in time, and we've managed to save the baby. But we have to keep a close eye on Grace. She's weak, and we'll need to monitor her for a while." Dan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Relief washed over him, but the worry still gnawed at him. How did this happen? I mean, she seemed fine this morning." The doctor's expression softened. "It's hard to say exactly. Placental abruption can sometimes be caused by high blood pressure, trauma, or other factors. But what's most important right now is that Grace and the baby are both stable." Dan nodded, still feeling the weight of what had just happened. He needed to know more. There was something about this that didn't sit right with him. As he sat back down, his mind went back to Murphy. The dog had been barking like he knew something was wrong. What if Murphy had somehow sensed the danger before anyone else did? Back at home, Mrs. Lewis was sitting by her front door, looking worried. She had heard about what happened. She knew it was time to tell Dan something important. She took a deep breath, knowing what she had to say. Murphy had been trying to warn Grace, and now it was time for her to tell the truth. The waiting room was silent except for the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. Dan sat with his head in his hands, trying to process everything that had happened. Grace was still in surgery, and he hadn't been able to see her yet. The doctors had told him it would take a little while. They needed to make sure she was stable after the emergency surgery. As the minutes dragged by, his mind kept going back to Murphy. The more he thought about the dog's strange behavior, the more it didn't make sense. Why had Murphy been so focused on Grace? What had he known that nobody else did? Dan rubbed his face, trying to push the thoughts away. The only thing that mattered right now was Grace and the baby. He had to keep his focus on them. Suddenly, the door to the waiting room opened, and Mrs. Lewis walked in. Her face was pale, and she looked as worried as Dan felt. She stood by the door for a moment before speaking. "Dan, I need to talk to you. It's about Murphy," she said softly. Dan stood up quickly, his heart racing. "Is something wrong with him? Is he okay?" Mrs. Lewis shook her head. "Murphy's fine, but I think he knew something was wrong with Grace before anyone else did." Dan frowned. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, clearly nervous. "I've never seen Murphy act like that before. He's always been a calm dog, but when he started barking at Grace, I knew something wasn't right. At first, I thought it was just a random thing, but then it kept happening. And it wasn't just barking. It was like he was trying to protect her." Dan felt a chill run down his spine. Protect her? From what? Mrs. Lewis looked at the floor, unable to meet his eyes. "That's what I don't know for sure. But a few days ago, I heard something. It was late at night. Murphy was barking like crazy, and I thought he was just being loud. But then I heard him whine. It was a strange sound. So I went outside to check on him." She paused, as if she was remembering something painful. "When I went out, Murphy was standing at the fence, staring at Grace's house, and I could hear her voice from inside, but it didn't sound right. She was breathing heavily, almost like she was in pain. I thought maybe she was sick, but I didn't want to bother her, so I went back inside." Dan's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what to say. Could Murphy have known something was wrong with Grace even before it got bad? Was that why the dog had been acting so strange? "I'm sorry," Mrs. Lewis continued, "but I think Murphy was trying to warn us. I should have done something sooner. I should have told you." Dan shook his head, still processing everything. "You couldn't have known. No one knew. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that Murphy had been trying to tell him something. Maybe the dog had sensed the danger that no one else could see. Maybe Murphy had known that something was wrong with Grace before it became an emergency. Mrs. Lewis looked at him with a pained expression. "I feel terrible. I wish I had done more." Dan put a hand on her shoulder. "It's not your fault. But we need to figure out how Murphy knew. He's not just a dog. He's something more. He's been protecting Grace in a way none of us understood." Just then, the door to the waiting room opened again, and a nurse stepped inside. She smiled at Dan, her face kind but tired. "Mr. Thompson, your wife is awake. You can see her now." Dan's heart leaped in his chest. "Thank you." He turned to Mrs. Lewis. "I'll talk to you later. I need to see Grace." Mrs. Lewis nodded, her eyes full of sympathy. "Of course. Take care of her, Dan." Dan hurried down the hallway to Grace's room. His heart was racing, and he felt a mixture of fear and relief. He pushed open the door and found Grace lying in bed, pale but awake. Her eyes brightened when she saw him. "Dan," she whispered, her voice weak but full of warmth. "You're here." "I'm here, Grace," he said, sitting beside her. "You're going to be okay. The baby's okay." Grace smiled faintly. "I'm so scared. I don't know what happened. Why did this happen?" Dan took her hand in his, holding it tightly. "We don't know for sure, but I think someone was watching over you. I think Murphy was trying to warn us. I think he knew something was wrong, even before it got this bad." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Murphy? But how?" Dan shrugged. "I don't know, but I'm sure of one thing. He's more than just a dog. He's our guardian." Grace smiled weakly. "I've always believed in miracles. Maybe this was one." The next few days felt like a blur. Grace was slowly recovering in the hospital, and Dan stayed by her side. The doctors were keeping a close eye on her, but she was getting stronger each day. The baby was fine, and that was the most important thing. Every time Grace's doctor checked in, he would smile and tell them how well things were going. But Dan couldn't stop thinking about Murphy. The more he thought about it, the more he felt sure that Murphy had saved Grace and the baby. He had warned them before the danger even started. It was almost as if the dog had known what was coming. But how? Dan had never believed in things like dog instincts or gut feelings before. He had always thought dogs were loyal and loving, but he had never imagined that they could sense something so life-threatening. Now, he wasn't so sure. It was the morning of the third day since Grace's surgery when Dan decided to take a walk. He needed to clear his head. He stepped outside the hospital, the cool air filling his lungs. The streets were quiet, and he walked down the sidewalk, his thoughts racing. He found himself in front of the Louises' house. He hadn't planned to go there, but his feet seemed to take him there on their own. He walked up to the front gate and stopped. The house was quiet. No barking, no growling. Murphy was nowhere in sight. Dan hesitated for a moment before reaching over and gently opening the gate. He didn't know why, but he felt like he needed to see the dog. He needed answers. He stepped into the yard, and that's when he saw Murphy. The dog was lying in the grass under a tree, his eyes closed. But when he heard Dan's footsteps, Murphy's head shot up. His golden eyes locked onto Dan's, and the dog's tail wagged once before he slowly stood up and walked toward him. Dan bent down and petted Murphy's head. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, his voice full of warmth. "I think you saved her. I think you saved both of them." Murphy sniffed Dan's hand and then nuzzled his face against his leg. It was like he knew exactly what Dan was saying. He could feel the connection between them. It wasn't just that Murphy was a dog. It was that Murphy was more than that. He was family. And he had protected Grace when no one else had known something was wrong. Dan sat down on the grass, and Murphy sat beside him, resting his head on Dan's lap. For a few moments, they both just sat there in silence, the wind rustling the leaves in the trees above them. "I don't know how you did it, Murphy," Dan whispered. "But thank you." The sound of footsteps behind them made Dan turn. Mrs. Lewis was standing in the doorway, watching them. She smiled when she saw Murphy with Dan. "You two seem to have become good friends," she said softly. Dan stood up and turned to face her. "I think I owe Murphy my life, and Grace's life too. You know, I've been trying to figure out what happened. How did Murphy know?" Mrs. Lewis looked at the ground, thinking for a moment. "Well, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. You might think it's strange, but I've read about this before. There are stories of dogs who can sense things we can't. Some people believe that dogs can smell changes in a person's body. They can detect chemicals, even before doctors do." Dan raised an eyebrow. "You mean Murphy could smell something was wrong with Grace?" Mrs. Lewis nodded. "It's possible. I've heard of dogs warning people when something's wrong, like a heart attack or a seizure. I think Murphy sensed the danger long before any of us knew, and he tried to warn you." Dan's mind was racing. Could that be true? Could Murphy have smelled the problem with Grace's pregnancy? It sounded unbelievable, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Murphy had been acting like he knew something was wrong, like he was trying to protect her. He looked down at the dog, who was now sitting at his feet, looking up at him with those big, trusting eyes. "You really are something special, Murphy." Mrs. Lewis smiled softly. "I think he's more than just a dog. I think he's a guardian." Dan knelt down to give Murphy one more pat on the head. "You're right. He is a guardian." That evening, Dan returned to the hospital with a new sense of gratitude. He couldn't wait to tell Grace everything. He had been focused on the doctors, on the hospital, but now he realized there was more to the story. Murphy had played a part in saving Grace and their baby, and he was going to make sure everyone knew it. Grace was resting when Dan walked into her room. He sat by her side, and she smiled up at him, her eyes still tired but full of love. "How's Murphy?" she asked softly. Dan grinned. "He's fine. He's been looking out for you, Grace, and I think he knew you needed help before we even realized it." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Murphy saved us. I always thought dogs were special, but this is something else." The days following Grace's surgery passed in a blur of hospital visits, phone calls, and good news. She was getting stronger every day. The doctors were confident that both Grace and the baby would be just fine. The emergency had passed, but Dan couldn't stop thinking about Murphy. The more he thought about it, the more he realized just how important the dog had been in saving them. Murphy wasn't just any dog. He was a guardian, a silent protector, watching over them when they couldn't see the danger themselves. Dan spent a lot of time sitting by Grace's bedside, holding her hand, and talking to her about what had happened. He told her everything Mrs. Lewis had said about Murphy possibly sensing something was wrong before they even knew it. Grace, still recovering, listened intently, her eyes wide with wonder. She had always loved animals, but what Murphy had done for her felt almost like a miracle. "I don't know what we would have done without him," Grace said one evening, her voice soft. "He saved us, Dan. I can feel it." Dan nodded, squeezing her hand. "I think you're right. I've never seen a dog act like that before. He knew something we didn't." That evening after dinner, Dan and Grace decided to go home. The hospital was no longer their place. Their home was where they belonged, surrounded by the comfort of their familiar space. Grace was still weak, but she was eager to return, and Dan knew it would help her heal. When they arrived home, the first thing they did was walk to the backyard. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light across the yard. They stood by the fence, looking out at the calm evening, and that's when Murphy appeared, trotting over to them. The dog's tail wagged furiously when he saw Grace, and he immediately went up to her, gently licking her hand. Grace laughed softly, tears welling in her eyes. "Murphy, you really did save us, didn't you?" Murphy sat beside her, his eyes full of loyalty and love, as if he understood every word. He looked up at Dan, as if asking for his approval, and Dan gave him a soft smile. "You did good, buddy," Dan said, his voice filled with warmth. "You're a true guardian." From that moment on, things began to settle into a peaceful rhythm. Grace's health improved every day, and soon she was back to her usual self, though still careful not to overdo it. The baby was healthy and growing strong. Dan and Grace were overjoyed, and they knew that their lives had been forever changed by the bond they shared with Murphy. Murphy, of course, was never far from their side. He slept by Grace's bed every night and followed her wherever she went. Dan had always known that dogs were loyal, but Murphy had taken it to a whole new level. He wasn't just a pet. He was family. One afternoon, several weeks later, Dan was sitting in the backyard with Murphy when Mrs. Lewis came over to visit. She had been so kind during all of this, checking in regularly, offering her support. Dan stood up and walked over to her with a smile. "Hey, Mrs. Lewis, thanks for stopping by." She smiled warmly. "I wanted to see how you all were doing. Grace and the baby, how are they?" "They're doing great," Dan said with a grin. "We're just settling in. Grace is back on her feet, and the baby's growing strong." "I'm so happy to hear that," she replied. "And I've been thinking a lot about Murphy. I know he's been a big help, but I wanted to say something. He's always been an amazing dog, but after everything that happened, I realized he's more than I ever knew. You're lucky to have him." Dan looked over at Murphy, who was now lying on the grass, looking at them with a calm, knowing gaze. "I think we're the lucky ones," he said softly. "He saved us in ways we'll never fully understand." Mrs. Lewis nodded. "You're right. There's something special about him." Dan smiled. "He's not just a dog. He's our guardian." As they stood there talking, Grace came outside, holding the baby in her arms. The little one was wrapped snugly in a blanket, looking up at the sky with wide eyes. Grace smiled at Murphy, and the dog stood up, walking over to her, giving the baby a gentle sniff before looking back at Grace with affection. Murphy had become a part of their family in ways they never expected. He wasn't just a pet. He was their protector, their friend, and their guardian. He had sensed the danger when no one else could, and because of him, Grace and the baby were safe. Dan looked around at his family, Grace, the baby, and Murphy. They were all together now, stronger than ever. The bond they shared was unbreakable, and Dan knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together, with Murphy by their side. The sun set behind them, painting the sky with beautiful shades of orange and pink. It was the perfect end to a perfect day, a new beginning for their family, filled with love, gratitude, and the protection of their faithful guardian. Weeks turned into months, and the little family found a rhythm they hadn't had before. Grace was fully recovered, and the baby, a healthy boy named Liam, was growing every day. Dan and Grace couldn't have been more in love with their new life, and Murphy had become a constant presence in their home. It seemed like nothing could go wrong. But life, as always, had its ups and downs, and one day they found themselves facing a new challenge, one that would test the strength of the bond between them all. It was early morning when Grace noticed it. She had just finished feeding Liam and was walking to the kitchen when she heard a strange sound coming from outside. It was Murphy's bark, but it wasn't the usual playful bark. It sounded urgent, almost frantic. Grace froze in her tracks, her heart racing. Something was wrong. She turned to look at Dan, who had just walked into the room. He, too, had heard the barking. "Dan, something's wrong with Murphy," Grace said, her voice tinged with concern. Dan immediately walked to the window, peering out into the backyard. The sight made his stomach drop. Murphy was pacing back and forth near the fence, barking nonstop, his tail not wagging as it usually did. His body was tense, his ears flat against his head. He was clearly distressed. "I don't like this," Dan said, his voice serious. "We need to go check on him." Grace nodded, her concern growing. I'll get Liam settled. You go." Dan hurried out the back door and into the yard, calling Murphy's name. The dog immediately stopped pacing and ran toward him, still barking urgently. When Murphy reached him, he didn't nuzzle or wag his tail like he normally did. Instead, he circled around Dan, looking up at him with a pleading expression in his eyes. Dan felt a chill run down his spine. Murphy wasn't just barking. He was trying to tell him something. But what? "What is it, boy?" Dan asked, kneeling down to Murphy's level. "What's wrong?" Suddenly, Murphy darted toward the far corner of the yard, near the woodshed. Dan stood up and followed, his heart racing. Murphy stopped at a spot near the edge of the yard and began pawing at the ground. Dan's breath caught in his throat. The ground had been disturbed, as though someone, or something, had recently dug there. He reached down and pushed the dirt aside, his hands shaking. When he saw what was buried there, his heart skipped a beat. It was a small metal box, half buried in the dirt. "What on earth?" Dan whispered, his voice thick with confusion. He pulled the box from the ground and dusted it off. It was old, covered in rust, but it looked like it had been hidden away for a long time. He flipped the latch, and when he opened it, a gasp escaped his lips. Inside, there were papers, old documents, photographs, and a small leather wallet. But what caught Dan's attention the most was the letter on top. He unfolded it carefully and began reading. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, but it was written in elegant handwriting. It spoke of secrets, things hidden for years, things meant to stay buried. It mentioned someone's name, someone who had once lived in the house before Dan and Grace had moved in. The letter seemed to warn of danger, a warning that had been left behind, forgotten by time. But what it meant, Dan didn't know yet. His mind raced. Was this why Murphy had been acting so strange? Was this box the source of the dog's anxiety? Dan stood up, holding the box tightly, looking around the yard. There was no telling what this mystery meant, but one thing was certain. Murphy had found it, and he had brought it to Dan's attention. Just then, Grace came out of the house, holding Liam in her arms. She looked at Dan, concern written all over her face. "What is it?" she asked, walking toward him. "What's going on?" Dan turned to her, holding up the box. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Grace's eyes widened as she looked at the box in his hands. "What is that?" "I don't know," Dan replied, "but I think we need to find out." Murphy stood beside Dan, watching them both with a look of quiet understanding. It was as if he knew the answers were close. But they weren't there yet. His protective instincts were stronger than ever, and Dan had a feeling that this mystery was far from over. The family had come through the first trial together, and now they were facing another, one that would require them to trust in each other, and in Murphy, more than ever. As Grace turned to head back into the house, Dan looked down at Murphy. The dog's eyes were steady, as though he knew the truth would come out eventually. Whatever danger had been hidden in the past, they were going to face it together, as a family. And with Murphy by their side, they would always be ready for whatever came next. The house was quiet, but the air felt heavy with questions. Dan stood in the yard, staring at the old metal box. He couldn't shake the feeling that something important was hidden in that box. Murphy sat by his side, his eyes steady, as if the dog already knew the answers they were searching for. Grace had gone inside to get her phone, and now Dan was left alone with the mystery. The wind rustled the trees in the backyard, and he looked over at the house. It was strange to think that someone had lived here before them, someone who had left behind secrets. But who were they? And why had they buried the box? Grace returned with her phone, her face a mixture of curiosity and concern. She stood next to Dan, looking at the box in his hands. "Do you think this is dangerous?" Grace asked softly. Dan wasn't sure how to answer. Part of him felt like they should be careful, that there was something more to this than they could understand. But another part of him felt drawn to it, like they were meant to uncover the truth. "I don't know," Dan replied. "But I feel like we need to find out." Grace nodded, her fingers tapping nervously on her phone screen as she began to search for information. She pulled up a few websites, scanning them quickly before turning back to Dan. "I don't see anything about this house being connected to anything dangerous," she said. "But there's something odd. It mentions an old family, the Carsons, who used to live here decades ago. They disappeared suddenly, and no one really knew what happened." Dan's heart skipped a beat. The name Carson was familiar. It had been mentioned in the letter inside the box, but he hadn't thought much of it at first. Could this family have something to do with the mystery? He handed the box to Grace, who examined it closely. It was clear now that the box wasn't just something someone had tossed aside. It had been deliberately hidden, kept safe for years. The papers inside seemed old, fragile, but still intact. "What's this?" Grace murmured, pulling out a photo from the box. She showed it to Dan, and his stomach sank. The photo was black and white, showing a young woman standing in front of the very house they now lived in. She was smiling, but there was a look of sadness in her eyes, as if she knew something the camera couldn't capture. Dan looked at the photo, then at the house behind them, the connection clear. The woman in the photo was standing in the same spot, right where they had seen Murphy acting so strangely. "This must be her," Grace said, her voice barely a whisper, "the woman who lived here before us." Dan felt a chill run down his spine. Could this woman have known something about the house? Had she left this message, buried in the yard, for someone to find? Grace continued to scroll through her phone, her eyes widening as she read something aloud. "There's an article from the local paper. It says the Carsons were known to be reclusive, but they were well liked in the community. However, one day, they simply disappeared. No one knows why. It was as if they vanished without a trace." Dan felt his mind race. This was no ordinary house. There was something much bigger at play here, something hidden beneath the surface. And Murphy, the loyal dog who had been so protective, had somehow known that there was danger lingering in the past. "I think we need to go inside," Grace said quietly, clutching Liam in her arms as the baby began to fuss. "This is too much to handle right now." Dan nodded. He wasn't sure what to think anymore, but he knew that their lives had been forever changed. The mystery was deepening, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn into something much bigger than themselves. As they entered the house, Murphy followed them, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a sense of alertness. The dog paced back and forth in the living room, his eyes scanning every corner of the room. It was as if he was on guard, waiting for something to happen. Dan looked at Grace. "I don't think we've seen the last of this," he said, his voice low. "There's more to this story. We need to figure out what happened to the Carsons and why this box was hidden." Grace nodded. "But how? Where do we even start?" Dan glanced down at the photo and the papers in his hands. They had clues, but they didn't have the full story. They needed to dig deeper, talk to people who had lived in the area longer. Maybe the neighbors knew something. Maybe the answers were right under their noses, hidden in plain sight. "I think we start by talking to the neighbors," Dan said. "Someone must know something." Grace agreed, but just as she opened her mouth to speak, there was a loud knock at the door. They both froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. Murphy barked loudly, standing in front of the door as if to protect them. With a deep breath, Dan walked toward the door, ready to face whatever came next.